Good morning, y'all. I'm excited to finally get into the Abraham portion of our study. Remember, this particular section we're in now, building up through Genesis, this is called God's promise of a people. But we really haven't seen why up until now. So far, we've seen how God created man in his own image, how sin entered the world, how it continued to build through Cain and through Cain's descendants, and on up through, well, all of Adam's descendants into the time of Noah. We saw last week how they built after the Tower of Babel and looked at that particular narrative, seeing how people just wouldn't do what they're supposed to do, and no matter what, it just seemed like they just wanted to ignore what God had told them to do, which should sound familiar because that's what we do. But here's the deal: just as God didn't destroy the world completely in the time of Noah, or destroy any of it in the time of the Tower of Babel, now we see him choosing a guy named Abram, who will be called later Abraham. And he doesn't choose him because he's great. He doesn't choose his nation. He doesn't choose his people. He chooses Abram and starts his people from him. And so to understand that and get into it, let's look at Genesis 12, 1 through 9 together. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation. And I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak at Moreh. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on, still going towards the Negeb. So when we look at this, really the only details we have here at the start is his father's name. He was, we just don't know a lot of that. We get that there in Genesis 11:27. We know he came from the land of Ur of the Chaldees, or the Chaldeans. And so looking at it, the idea is he doesn't come from any background that we would say, hey, he was taught by his father and his father's father to worship the Lord. All we know about Abram is God calls him, and Abram responds. Abram responds in faith. God says, go eastward or go west, and Abram goes west. When he gets there, he builds an altar and worships. He says he calls upon the name of the Lord. And so this is a big deal, because as we've seen so far in Genesis, there's a lot that we see of people like, okay, God said do this, I'm not going to do that. All right, God said do this, well, I would rather do that. Here we see God calling Abram, and he's 75 years old. Imagine God calling you at your age and saying, all right, pack up, leave everybody, leave everything, and you and your spouse just pack up and go east, really have no direction, kind of, I'll tell you you're there when you get there, right? Go to the land that I will show you. That would be terrifying. People would think you were crazy. But here's the deal. We see Abram respond in faith. Is so powerful, is so poignant, right? To see something different than, hey, they sinned again, they sinned again, they sinned again, right? And so this isn't to say Abram is perfect, but it's looking at that faith response. Abram obeyed immediately. He believed God's promise, and through him, God would begin this great work. I want to go back and look at one of these verses in here because it's a very cool messianic prophecy here. So we know there was the prophecy of the Messiah back in Genesis 3:15 that Satan would strike at the seed of woman's heel, and the offspring would crush the head of Satan. Here we see in Genesis 12:3 where he's saying, okay, I will bless those who bless you, curse those who dishonor you. But look at this last part. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. That one day, that same descendant from Genesis 3:15 is also going to descend through the lineage of Abraham. We know later David comes into play there, and this is the lineage. It's talking about Jesus. All the families of the earth will be blessed through Jesus, and that's just such a big deal, especially, and if you know how this plays out, you know it's another nearly 25 years before Abram conceives his heir. So, I mean, this is something that's a really big deal calling here, because it takes a lot more than just, hey, go east sort of faith. It's like, hey, go east, and now that you're beyond the realm of, you know, people expecting, oh, well, okay, you'll have a child or you can conceive. Abram he's beyond that now, and we're talking another 25 years. So it's awesome to see here how God has a plan. We move on through here. There's some things we need to see in addition to that messianic prophecy that are parts of the big promise God made to Abram. The first part is the land. He said, go to this land, I'll show you. We know that that's the land of Canaan that would later be given to his descendants. It's a big deal because not only is God forming a people, he's giving them a place to live, right? And the people, that's the second part there. God promised Abram that he would make him into a great nation. That meant Abram would have many descendants, not just Jesus generations and generations down the line, but he would have enough descendants that we know later on God tells him that his descendants will number like the grains of sand on the seashore or the stars in the heavens. This is a big deal, that going from just thinking back to the Garden of Eden, they had a place there. God had told them to be fruitful and multiply. But in Genesis 3, we see no multiplication happening. We see them expelled from their place. But now God's saying, hey, there's some restoration to the things that were lost. Yes, people have been dispersed all over the earth, finally subduing, right, as he had told them, the earth. And now we see God forming his people, giving them a place to live. And then that third part, we see the blessing that he gives to Abram, that we've already said that Jesus is a part of that for all the families of the earth, but Abram's family would be blessed, and the people who blessed them would be blessed. The people who cursed them would be cursed. This is a huge deal that will reach out through to the entire world, even to today. And so looking at this, these are promises that only God could fulfill. Again, you look at it, he's going to a land that's inhabited. He's 75 years old. He's leaving everything he knew. This is how this promise of a people, it begins, but it also, look at the faith that it takes to believe that. Again, what if God called you at your age to just up and go? That's some faith right there. And so we think about this. Think about the things in here that would require faith. Where you're going. What do you believe will happen when you get there? And think about why that sets Abram apart. Now, this next part, and I'm very interested to see when we get later on in the book of Hebrews what John is going to do with Melchizedek, because I've got theories, and I don't even know. Like Melchizedek's something else, right? So sometime after Abram gets there, this is, after he's gone to Egypt and you got all those issues, he comes back, and this mysterious king of Salem, king of Shalom, Melchizedek, shows up after a battle. And again, it's almost a little bit of spoilers here, because we're going to see some stuff about Melchizedek coming up in Hebrews. And so let's look at Genesis 14 to kind of get a picture here. In the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goim, these kings made war with Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemebar, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. And all these joined forces in the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. 12 years they had served Kedorlaomer, but in the 13th year they rebelled. In the 14th year, Kedorlaomer and the kings who were with him came and defeated Rephaim and Ashtaroth Karnaim, the Zuzim in Ham, the Emim in Shava Kiriathaim, and the Horites in their hill country of Seir, as far as El Paran on the border of the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and defeated all the country of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites who were dwelling in Hazazon Tamar. Then the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, went out, and they joined battle in the valley of Siddim with Kedorlaomer, the king of Elam, Tidal, king of Goim, Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar, 4 kings against 5. Now the valley of Siddim was full of bitumen pits, and as the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some fell into them, and the rest fled to the hill country. So the enemy took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went their way. They also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, who was dwelling in Sodom, and his possessions, and went their way. Then one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, who was living by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and of Aner. These were allies of Abram. When Abram heard that his kinsman had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. And he divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. Then he brought back all the possessions, and also brought back his kinsman Lot with his possessions and the women and the people. After his return from the defeat of Kedorlaomer, And the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom, went out to meet him in the valley of Shavah, that is the king's valley. And here we are. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. And he blessed them and said, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. And the king of Sodom said to Abram, Give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted my hand to the Lord, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I would not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich. I will take nothing but what the young men have eaten, and the share of the men who went with me. Let Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre take their share. So when you look at this is this crazy battle of these 9 kings, 5 against 4. And initially, Abram's not involved in it, but then they come and tell him that some of his allies that he has made there in the land have been taken captive. By this time, Abram, again, he's gone all the way to Egypt. He's got more people. He's got 318 people who have been born in his house. They've grown up enough that they're able to fight in battle. And he's like, I'm going to take my 318 guys and we're going to go in here and get some stuff done. And they do. They turn the tide of the war. They win. And when you look at this, I don't know, it's just such a cool contrast where it's like, all right, I believe the Lord's going to take me through this. And he does. Most of the time you don't think of a strong warrior in his 80s, except for LG. He's the only strong warrior in his 80s I can think of. But no, Abraham goes out here, chases these guys down, defeats them, and rescues his nephew. That's such a huge deal there. And so Abram, when he returns, meets 2 guys, the king of Sodom, who was, you know what's going to happen to Sodom and Gomorrah here in a few chapters. He's a pagan ruler, and he wants to reward him. He wants to like, hey, man, you just tell me what you want to take here. Like, I'll just take the people, you take the stuff. And Abram refuses, saying, look, I don't want to become rich from what you've got. I don't want you to be able to hold this over me. The other guy he meets, this mysterious guy who is called a prophet of God Most High. And when you look at this, the way that Melchizedek talks about God, he calls him God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, there in Genesis 14:19. That's the same way that Abram talks about him in verse 22, except he adds to that Yahweh, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And so we know there's a kinship here with Abram and Melchizedek. He recognizes that they both are worshipers of the Lord. And then he essentially gives the first tithe, 1/10 of everything he had. And you need to remember, these aren't spoils of war. This is out of what he had beforehand. Here's a 10th right off the top. And so when you look at this, it seems random from our perspective. Again, I'm excited to hear what John's going to do with the Melchizedek passages in Hebrews. But there's significance here, right? Doesn't say anything about where Melchizedek came from. It's like he just pops out of nowhere. He was, again, priest of God Most High. He was a worshiper of the Lord. Remember, before God called Abram when he was 75, he wasn't a worshiper of the Lord. He wasn't a worshiper of God Most High. Not only is Melchizedek a priest, but it says he's the king of Salem, of Shalom. This will come into play a little bit later. Shalom means peace. He's the King of Peace. Should sound familiar to us. And again, some people think this will be Jerusalem later on. Abraham gives him a tenth, gives him a tithe, and so there's a lot of respect there. And we'll get to Melchizedek later, hopefully after John deals with Hebrews chapter 5. Well, it'll definitely be after that. But I want to introduce an idea to you here, because some people, they want to say that this is a pre-incarnate Jesus, but Hebrews doesn't leave that necessarily open to us. Melchizedek is what we would call a type, Type, which is a picture of Jesus. It's a symbol of Jesus ahead of time in his role with God's people. Melchizedek, King of Peace, Jesus, Prince of Peace. You kind of see where I'm going with that. When you look at this, like Melchizedek, Jesus, he does descend from David, but no strictly human roots. He came from heaven as God with human flesh, right? He's 100% God, 100% man, and as God, he's got no lineage. He's always been. Jesus would be a priest and king, or prophet, priest, and king, and that's under the law of Moses. The Levites were the priests, and nobody was king of the tribe of Levi, right? David of the tribe of Judah, Saul of the tribe of Benjamin, right? When you look at this, nobody else has been a Levite king, right? And so this foreshadows the kind of leader that we would have one day in Jesus. Again, Jesus, prophet, priest, and king. As I said earlier, some people do believe that Melchizedek was Jesus. And literally, we find out in Hebrews 7 too that Melchizedek translates King of Righteousness. Come on, he's definitely pointing to Jesus. And so the idea there is more likely he's a type pointing toward Jesus. So the cool thing about this, it's not just a bunch of random stuff here. What we see is the Bible fits together with the Bible. What we're reading and studying in Hebrews in our Sunday morning worship, we're going to see, especially when we get on up to Hebrews 11, that this all fits together. It's a single narrative written over the course of several couple thousand years by multiple writers, but ultimately written by a single author, God the Holy Spirit. And so when we talk about these things, we talk about how everything points to Jesus. This isn't, well, let me think about it like this. Some people who are opponents of Christianity and opponents of the Bible try to break it apart and make it less than the whole. They feel like looking at it as a whole narrative, they see that as a bit too convenient because they feel like it's all put together retroactively or after the fact. But what we see here is from the very beginning, God is gradually revealing himself more and more, right? If you think back to our study of how we got the Bible and how we can trust that the Bible we have is God's Word, we know that gradual revelation is him introducing himself to his people. That when God introduces himself specifically to Moses in Exodus 34, that is the character of God we've seen from Genesis 1 through Exodus 33, and then beyond Exodus 34 to Revelation, we see God's character being consistent. We see his righteousness consistent, his steadfast love consistent, his being slow to anger, right? His forgiveness. This is a big deal. It's in looking at the themes as we are here and seeing how these things are connected, it's very important that we keep this understanding that the Bible is a single narrative. When we talk about these scenes, we're not talking about made-up stories. We're talking about God's narrative introducing himself. And so it kind of makes me think of how to frame this more clearly. All right, y'all know my day job is as an English teacher. And one of the things that I have to make sure my freshmen and sophomores understand is the difference in how some genres of literature work, right? If it's a historical text, we need to know the history that's being told there. If it is a biography, we know that someone is telling someone else's life story. If it's an autobiography, someone is telling their own life story. But there is a genre, and I'm going to say it the way it's supposed to be pronounced. Then I'm going to say it the way that it's spelled, so you'll know what I'm talking about. A memoir, memoir, as we would say in Mississippi, a memoir, right? A memoir it's a little biography. It's a little autobiography. It's a little history, but it goes where the author wants to take it. If you're writing your memoirs, you're not necessarily telling your whole life story. The parts of your life story you tell are to introduce certain things, to relay certain thoughts that you want to relay. And so far, in kind of looking at Genesis as it is historical, it is biographical, it is autobiographical, considering God's introducing himself, but he's not telling every single thing about every single person on earth. He's introducing himself as God Most High, the possessor of everything. Just as Melchizedek said there in his blessing, he is God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. He is blessed, and he's powerful. He's powerful enough that he created things with just his voice. He spoke, and things came into existence that didn't even have ingredients beforehand. Everything that makes up the periodic table of elements came into existence just because he spoke. He molded man with his own hands, breathed his breath into his lungs, the breath of life, and he became a living soul. You see here this God who is so high above everything is personal. We see even in Cain slaying his brother Abel, God comes down and talks to him. We see when the God is personally and intimately involved in Noah and his family's life. We see Tower of Babel, when they are so arrogant. We see him, they're trying to build this tower saying, look at how awesome we are. We're going to build a tower all the way up to heaven, and heaven comes down to where they are. And now we see that God has chosen Abram. God has given him all these promises. When we look at this, what do we learn about the Lord? And that's kind of where I want to leave us today. What do we learn about the Lord in the life of Abram? That he is a God who saves. He's a God who sets his affections on people. He's a God who makes big, grand promises. I'm thinking of the phrase from today's passage in our worship service, that such a great salvation. He is a great God. He's God Most High, and he can promise things beyond our imaginations, and we don't have to worry about them coming true, because he is God and he is faithful to complete what he says. But ultimately, it comes down to the same issue with Abraham. And we're going to see this pop up in Genesis. You see it pop up multiple times in Romans and in Galatians, that Abram trusted God and it was counted to him as righteousness. That Abram believed what God said, trusted him, had faith in him, and God counted that as righteousness. So the question for y'all is, do you trust him? Do you trust him with the big things? If he called you with some grand calling on your life, would you go? But I think the most important question there is, if you're considering whether you would go if he's calling you into these great grand gestures, do you trust him with the little things? Do you trust him with the everyday? And I think that's where our faith is really tested, not in the big moments, but in the little everyday moments where we're trying to grasp for control and we're more Tower of Babel than let's go to Canaan. And so ponder those things. Think about faith. Think about the way we can trust our great God, God Most High. And then when we get into next week talking about the covenant God made with Abram, I think it's going to all make more sense. Just as last time, I'll see y'all in just a little bit. Look forward to being in worship with you later today. Bye-bye.